Karen Dubinsky is a professor emerita in global development studies and history at Queen's University and author of Strangely Friends, a history of Cuban-Canadian encounters. Karen, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks.
Remind me, were you in Cuba? Was it in February? Was
I
just like
was, yeah,
right? Yeah.
I just got back a couple of weeks ago. So I was there for, I saw, things have been bad there for a really long time. I saw normal bad, and then I saw like, ramped up bad with when the oil blockade started. And that the effects, it was actually amazing. The effects were almost immediate. You could see, all of a sudden there's no buses on the street. All of a sudden school kids are on the street, not at school, things like that. I didn't see yet the grocery shelves dwindling, but that must be happening now.
All right, well, let's talk about it. Soft power is described as diplomacy without diplomats. How has Canada exercised soft power in Cuba?
Canada's been actually doing that for really quite a long time. My book studies the period from the Cuban Revolution on, so that's 1959 on. That was a bit of an arbitrary decision. It's not like soft power was invented in 1959, but Canada and Cuba famously and uniquely, it was only Canada and Mexico that maintained unbroken diplomatic ties with Cuba after the revolution. And in Canada's case, at least, Canada got involved in aid projects, development aid projects. There's been a long history of education exchange projects, of which is where which drew me into this story personally. I used to help to coordinate an exchange between my university, Queen's University, and the University of Havana that brought Canadian students to Cuba for almost 20 years. And my other interest, and the interest of many people in Canada, is Cuban culture. And there's been ties, musical ties, between the two countries for decades. And in fact, many Cuban musicians, excellent Cuban musicians, make their home in Canada now.
I want to talk about education as a soft power. In your book, Strangely Friends, A History of Canadian-Cuban Encounters, you write, the goal of the Ciudad Universitaria Jose Antonio Echeverria project, also known as the CUJAE, was straightforward: to establish a graduate program in engineering staffed by Cubans, but with strong professional and fraternal links with Canadian universities. The pilot project began in February 1972. 25 Canadian engineering professors gave 3-week summer courses to graduate students of CUJAE, as well as engineers working in industry. The Universities of Toronto, Waterloo, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan participated, presided over by an academic advisory board chaired by Canadian University Services Overseas. How much of Cuba's technical and cultural development has been a result of Canada exercising those soft powers?
Yeah, that's a really that project was fascinating. I taught for many years in a global development studies program, and so one of the things that's fascinating about the acronym goes by, or the title goes by the acronym CUHI.
Kuhai.
The CUHI project worked because it did what it planned to do. And its goals were in some ways modest. I mean, it's a big project, help a university develop an engineering program, a graduate level engineering program, so that those people that were in the program could then go on and teach themselves, right? So it worked in that sense because it had the modest goal not of saving Cuba, not of creating a kind of dependent relationship on Canadian superior technology, superior education, but rather a one-time, multi-year project that taught Cubans in order for them to continue teaching themselves. And that was CUSO, the organization, the Canadian organization that developed it. That was their philosophy in those years, and that meshed perfectly with what the Cuban authorities wanted in those years as well.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about the Canadian students that you have taken on to the exchanges that you had talked about. What did they learn outside of the classroom?
Oh my goodness. It's well, there's were so many fascinating things to observe as a professor. Havana in those years that it took place, the whole course took place in the city of Havana. I could barely imagine taking 20 to 30 young 20-year-old, mostly unilingual, or at least certainly not Spanish speaking, students with me to a big global South city or a big, let's even just say Latin American city, and basically letting them, letting them go where they wanted to go. It was, that's changing, but it was an incredibly safe place for students to be, so they could go off on their own and talk to people and all kinds of people. Havana is, of course, on the tourist route, but less so than some of the resorts. So the sight of Canadian students often, congregating in large numbers on the seawall or at a restaurant or at any kind of downtown location, certainly around the university, that was a sight. That was a sight. That was not a usual sight. And so they struck up all kinds of friendships and had all kinds of conversations, which was also great because they heard things from Cubans on the street that didn't always correspond to what they were hearing from their professors, their Cuban professors in the classroom. And so that made for, especially around things like racism, actually,
What
that
were they
made for
saying?
some really, um, oh, well, I'll stick with the example of racism. They were sometimes heard a rosy picture from their predominantly white, not exclusively by any means, but from their predominantly white Cuban instructors about how the revolution had solved the problems of racism because because there was no racial discrimination in the law. And in that, in the legal sense, that was completely true, as it is and was in Canada. People on the street would approach our, again, predominantly white students, but sometimes with a racial mix among the Canadian students, and that led to conversations about racism in Canada compared to racism in Cuba, and they would hear stories. They would definitely hear stories about racism in Cuba from the street level that they weren't getting at the heights of the university classroom. So things like that were always, so the students would sometimes wonder who to believe,
Right.
which helped us to encourage them to think that lots of things can be true at the same time, right? That there wasn't a who to believe. There was people speak from their experience. You have to take all of those experiences into account.
Well, let's take those experiences and talk a little bit about influence. In what ways does soft power influence, official policy at higher levels of government?
Yeah, that's I think that's always the question. When you're talking about things like popular or cultural diplomacies, it's really clear. And it was clear to me from my experience teaching there, and then later on from the research that I did, that I picked development aid and education and music, but I could have also studied sport, and I could have also certainly studied tourism to look at the many ways in which ties between people at the ground level, at the popular level, are are profound, and in the case of Canada, Cuba, multiple, and have been going on for decades. What does that have to do with Canadian-Cuban relations at the more elite level, at the level of external affairs ministers and prime ministers? I think speaking on the Canadian side, Canadian government policy is obviously informed by what is perceived to be the mood of the country at any one place and at any one time, or on any one issue. And the fact, we've just seen it recently when the Canadian government or excuse me, it wasn't the government, when the Canadian travel industry, airline industry, made the decision very quickly to stop flying to Cuba in the midst of this oil crisis that they're having. There was a huge reaction, and not, sometimes from thwarted vacationers in the middle of February looking forward to going to a beach.
Mhm.
That's understandable. But also what that really showed, I think, was the Canadian tourists have many Canadian tourists have long-standing ties with Cuba, with visiting, with people who they meet in their travels, with people who they stay with, and those ties continue maybe beyond the initial kind of business relationship and continue into friendships. And so when dramatic things happen, like is happening now, you see a kind of an outpouring of concern that isn't abstract, that
Hmm.
isn't philosophical, but it's actually based on concern about people,
Well,
excuse me,
let's
about people's friendships.
well, let's move that concern into action. If the Canadian government chooses to, how could it use soft power to help Cubans right now?
Well, I mean, we don't live in much of we don't, soft power is
Hmm.
less of a practice, let's say, these days, thanks to largely, I think, thanks to the government, at least from from our Canadian perspective, from the government of Donald Trump is
Right.
using, soft power is not strangling a country by refusing anybody to sell them oil, and soft power is certainly not bombing other countries, as we've seen, as is going on now in Iran. How do the sharp edges of hard power, how do those function with the softer edges of soft power is a really good question. And I guess I would go back to what I was saying. When you have a long history, decades long, let's say, in the case of Cuba, when you have a long history of relations between people, whether they be sports teams or tourists or Canadian students and Cuban instructors, it's harder to demonize a country. It's harder to talk about a country as an enemy when people have their actual own experience of relations. So maybe that's the best example that I can come up with, that when a country that with whom you have had relations is in trouble and asks for help, maybe it becomes less of an official abstract request and more helping a friend.
Karen, we are going to leave it there. Really appreciate your insights on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.